After 45 years of marriage, Shirley thought the betrayal was over the moment she filed for divorce, until she discovered her husband had spent 16 years secretly trying to steal the one thing her father died protecting. What she found hidden behind a loose brick in her abandoned childhood home changed everything. For 45 years, Shirley believed she understood the shape of her life. It was not a perfect life, but it was stable, respectable, familiar. The kind of life that becomes so routine you stop examining it too closely. Every morning followed a rhythm she could predict without thinking. Coffee at 6:30, breakfast prepared before her husband came downstairs, the quiet hum of ordinary conversations that long marriages are built on, grocery lists, dinner plans, bills paid on time, holidays celebrated in the same house year after year. To anyone looking from the outside, Shirley's marriage looked dependable, even enviable in the calm and polished way older couples sometimes appear after decades together. But betrayal rarely arrives all at once. It grows slowly in hidden spaces while ordinary life continues on the surface. That was the terrifying thing Shirley began to understand. Her husband had not destroyed their marriage in one dramatic moment. He had built an entirely separate reality alongside it while she continued faithfully living inside the illusion of the first one. The frightening part was not only the lies themselves. It was how normal everything had looked while the lies were happening. That realization began on a Tuesday morning because of something as insignificant as a burning toaster. Shirley moved through the house checking each room for the smell, performing the same practical task she had performed thousands of times before. Nothing about that morning felt important. Nothing warned her that the next few minutes would split her life into a before and an after. Then her sleeve caught the edge of the folder. It was such a small accident, a careless movement, a folder slipping from a desk, papers scattering across the floor. The kind of moment most people would forget within seconds. But Shirley stood frozen as the document spread in front of her because she immediately recognized something wrong. The bank account number was unfamiliar. That detail alone unsettled her. After 45 years of marriage, there should not have been unfamiliar accounts. She had handled household finances for decades. She knew where the money went. She knew their routines, their expenses, their savings habits. Marriage creates patterns, and Shirley knew theirs intimately. Yet these statements belonged to a life she had never seen before. At first she tried to make the pieces fit into some reasonable explanation, maybe a business account, maybe an investment she had forgotten about, but the longer she looked, the more impossible those explanations became. The transactions formed a pattern too personal to misunderstand: private school tuition, rent payments in Richmond, grocery purchases, pediatrician visits, clothing stores. Not random expenses. A family's expenses. And not for a month or two, 16 years. That number echoed in Shirley's mind with a strange coldness. 16 years meant this hidden life had not been temporary. It had not been a mistake or a short-lived affair. It had existed long enough to grow roots, long enough for routines to develop, long enough for children to grow up inside it. 16 years meant that while Shirley was cooking dinners, hosting holidays, and sitting beside her husband at family gatherings, another version of his life had been unfolding in parallel. The cruelty of betrayal is not always in what happened. Sometimes it is in the realization that, while you were fully committed to one reality, someone else was carefully managing two. Shirley did not scream. She did not confront him immediately. That restraint revealed something important about her character. People often imagine betrayal creates explosive moments, but real shock can become strangely quiet. Her mind moved past emotion and directly into observation. She carefully returned every paper exactly where it belonged because she understood instantly that knowledge was power now. For perhaps the first time in her marriage, she stopped behaving like a trusting wife and began behaving like someone studying the architecture of a deception. And once she began looking, she saw things differently everywhere. His frequent business trips years earlier suddenly rearranged themselves into evidence. His private office no longer felt like a harmless preference, but a controlled territory. The boundaries she had respected for decades began to look less natural and more intentional. That was one of the deepest emotional truths in Shirley's story. Betrayal changes the meaning of memory itself. Moments that once seemed ordinary become suspicious in hindsight. Innocent explanations begin collapsing under new information. Entire decades must be mentally re-examined because trust was the lens through which everything had originally been interpreted. Shirley realized she had spent years accepting invisible rules inside her own marriage. She knocked before entering his office. She never opened certain drawers. She avoided asking too many questions because somewhere over time she had learned which areas of life belonged to her and which did not. The terrifying part was that nobody had formally imposed these rules. She had absorbed them slowly through repetition, compromise, and routine until they felt natural. That is how hidden betrayal often survives for years, not through dramatic manipulation every single day, but through small conditioned silences that become normal. Her husband understood this. He understood Shirley's reliability, her loyalty, and her tendency to preserve peace. He depended on those qualities because they created the perfect environment for secrecy. While she protected the marriage, he protected the lies inside it. And yet the story becomes powerful because Shirley eventually changes. The discovery of the folder becomes more than exposure. It becomes awakening. For the first time in years, Shirley begins observing her life instead of simply maintaining it. She notices details. She asks questions. She follows evidence instead of assumptions. The woman who spent decades supporting everyone else quietly transforms into someone reclaiming authority over her own reality. That transformation begins with patience. Instead of collapsing emotionally, Shirley gathers information. She photographs documents. She contacts an attorney privately. She studies financial records. She allows herself to see clearly rather than desperately protecting the illusion of what she hoped her marriage had been. That is what makes her story emotionally compelling. She is not portrayed as weak for trusting her husband. She is portrayed as human. Trust is not foolish when love has been built over decades. The tragedy belongs to the person who abused that trust, not the person who gave it sincerely. As Shirley uncovers more evidence, the betrayal deepens beyond infidelity into something colder and more calculating. The forged documents connected to her father's property reveal that her husband's deception was never only emotional. It was strategic, financial, intentional. He had not merely lied to preserve another relationship. He had manipulated her ignorance for personal gain. He had relied on her trust as a resource to exploit. And that realization cuts deeper than heartbreak. Because heartbreak says someone stopped loving you. Manipulation says someone studied your goodness and used it against you. That distinction changes Shirley permanently. The life she once defended begins to look like a carefully managed structure built around keeping her uninformed. Every compromise she made now appears inside a harsher light. Every silence becomes evidence of how thoroughly she had been conditioned not to question things. But the most remarkable part of Shirley's journey is that once the illusion collapses, she does not lose herself. She finds herself. The betrayal destroys the false version of her life, but it also removes the fog surrounding who she really is. Beneath the years of accommodation and quiet endurance is a woman capable of precision, intelligence, patience, and strength. A woman who can rebuild. A woman who can walk away. A woman who can finally stop living inside someone else's carefully managed story and begin telling her own. Shirley spent most of her life believing love was something loud people talked about in movies and books, while real love was quieter. Real love, she believed, was responsibility, consistency, showing up every day without complaint, cooking meals, remembering birthdays, paying bills on time, sitting beside the same person year after year through ordinary life. She believed love was built through patience and sacrifice more than dramatic words. For decades, she thought she had built exactly that kind of life with her husband. It was only after everything collapsed that she fully understood another kind of love had been quietly working beside her all along. A quieter love, a wiser one, the kind that prepares protection long before danger fully reveals itself. Her father had never liked unnecessary conversation. William Greer was not the kind of man who lectured people or inserted himself loudly into the lives of others. He believed in watching carefully before speaking. When he did speak, his words were measured and specific. Shirley had grown up understanding that silence around him did not mean absence. It meant attention. As a child, she sometimes mistook that quietness for emotional distance. Her friends had fathers who were louder, more expressive, more openly affectionate. William Greer was different. He repaired things before they broke completely. He checked locks every night before bed. He woke before sunrise to make coffee and prepare the house for the day before anyone else was awake. He noticed when storms were coming before clouds fully formed. He believed care was proven through preparation. Only much later did Shirley understand how rare that quality really was. When she married Dante at 25, her father welcomed him politely but cautiously. He never openly objected to the marriage. He never tried to interfere. If he had concerns, he carried them privately. At the time, Shirley interpreted that restraint as approval. Now she recognized it differently. Her father was the kind of man who understood that warnings rarely work when someone is in love. People do not abandon their futures because someone else feels uneasy. They need time to arrive at truth themselves. So William Greer did something more useful than arguing. He paid attention. Over the years, Shirley occasionally noticed moments she did not fully understand at the time. Her father watching Dante a little too carefully during family dinners, the pauses before answering certain questions, the way conversations sometimes shifted when financial matters came up. Nothing dramatic, nothing concrete enough to confront, just small moments that lingered strangely afterward. But William Greer belonged to a generation of men who believed actions mattered more than speeches. He did not sit Shirley down and tell her her husband could not be trusted. He did not attempt to destroy her marriage with suspicion he could not prove. Instead, he quietly built safeguards. That decision changed her life. 6 months before his death, William altered his will. The family farmhouse and surrounding land in Shenandoah County would belong solely to Shirley, not jointly shared with her husband, not partially controlled through marriage, entirely hers. At the time, Shirley barely questioned it. Aging parents adjusted legal documents all the time. She assumed her father was simply organizing his affairs carefully before his health declined further. She thanked him, hugged him, and filed the paperwork away without understanding its significance. But her father understood. Somewhere inside his careful observations, he had recognized something dangerous about the man Shirley married. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the future betrayal in full, but enough to know that his daughter might one day need something protected from the person closest to her. That realization became overwhelming after Shirley found the hidden documents years later. Standing in her bedroom rereading the will, she finally saw her father's decision clearly for the first time. Her name alone, every word deliberate, every legal protection intentional. He had quietly constructed a barrier around the one inheritance he believed mattered most. And he had done it without humiliating her. That mattered deeply to Shirley once she understood it. Her father had protected her without forcing her to choose between loyalty to him and loyalty to her husband. He had respected her autonomy while still preparing for the possibility that she might someday need help she could not yet imagine. That is what made his love extraordinary. It was not controlling love. It was protective love. The difference between those things is enormous. Controlling love demands obedience in exchange for safety. Protective love preserves freedom while building support quietly in the background. William Greer never demanded Shirley distrust her husband. He simply made sure that if trust failed, she would not lose everything. Years later, after Shirley arrived at the farmhouse following the divorce filing, she began understanding her father in ways she never had before. Every room in the old house carried evidence of the kind of man he had been. The repaired cabinets that still functioned perfectly after decades, the carefully labeled tools in the pantry, the sturdy walls and maintained structure. Everything reflected someone who believed permanence came from care applied consistently over time. The farmhouse itself became a symbol of his love. It had waited for her. That realization struck Shirley repeatedly during those first weeks alone in the house. While her marriage had required constant emotional management and accommodation, the house asked nothing from her except presence. It stood exactly as her father had intended, solid and dependable through years of neglect and silence. Even abandoned, it protected her. And then came the discovery behind the loose brick. The tin box hidden inside the kitchen wall transformed her understanding of her father completely. Sitting at the table with the documents spread before her, Shirley felt something larger than shock. She felt seen across time. Her father had known enough to leave evidence. Not vague suspicions, not emotional warnings, evidence. The geological surveys, the title records, the handwritten letter to his attorney, every document carefully preserved in case Shirley someday needed the truth. What moved her most was not the value of the lithium deposits or the financial implications. It was one simple sentence written in her father's handwriting. "I know my Shirley, and I know that if she ever needs this, she will know what to do with it." That sentence carried decades of faith inside it. Not pity, not fear, faith. William Greer did not preserve those documents because he thought his daughter was weak. He preserved them because he trusted her strength even before she fully trusted it herself. That kind of parental love changes people. Many parents attempt to protect children by controlling outcomes, forcing decisions, or shielding them from difficulty entirely. William Greer understood something wiser. He knew he could not live Shirley's life for her. He could not choose her marriage, fight her battles, or prevent betrayal from entering her world. But he could preserve her ability to survive it. So he left her tools instead of instructions, evidence instead of speeches, protection instead of control. And years later, when everything else in Shirley's life collapsed, those quiet preparations became the foundation she rebuilt upon. The emotional power of her father's love lies in its patience. He never needed recognition for what he did. He never expected Shirley to fully understand while he was alive. Real love, he believed, was not performed for applause. It was built carefully so it would still exist when needed most. That is why the farmhouse feels almost alive throughout Shirley's journey. It is not merely property. It is the physical continuation of her father's care. Every repaired floorboard, every preserved document, every deliberate legal choice carries his presence forward long after his death. And through that inheritance, Shirley begins redefining what love truly means. Not manipulation disguised as marriage. Not sacrifice without reciprocity. Not decades spent shrinking herself to maintain someone else's comfort. Love, she realizes, is the person who quietly protects your future even when you do not yet understand why. Love is preparation. Love is preservation. Love is someone building something strong enough to hold you when the rest of your life falls apart. And perhaps the most beautiful part of Shirley's story is that her father's love does not trap her in the past. It gives her the freedom to finally step into her future at 70 years old. Shirley stood in her kitchen, packing 2 weeks of clothing into the trunk of her car, and realized something that frightened her more than the divorce itself. She had no idea who she was without the life she had spent 45 years maintaining. That realization settled quietly over her as she folded sweaters and placed framed photographs into cardboard boxes. Most people imagine starting over as something young people do. A temporary chapter after college, after heartbreak, after early mistakes. But Shirley understood now that starting over at 70 felt entirely different. There was no comforting illusion of endless time ahead. No fantasy that life would automatically reorganize itself neatly. At her age, leaving meant dismantling almost everything familiar and stepping into uncertainty with no guarantee of what waited on the other side. And yet she left anyway. That was what made her decision extraordinary. She did not leave because she had a perfect plan. She left because staying inside a lie had finally become more unbearable than the fear of beginning again. For decades, Shirley had measured herself through usefulness to others. She managed the household. She organized holidays. She maintained routines. She anticipated needs before they were spoken aloud. Somewhere along the way, she had confused stability with fulfillment because stability was what she had been taught to value. If everyone around her was comfortable, then she believed she must be doing life correctly. But betrayal shattered that illusion. The discovery of the secret accounts and forged documents forced Shirley to confront something deeper than infidelity. It forced her to realize how much of herself had disappeared inside the constant maintenance of someone else's world. She had spent years adapting quietly, compromising gradually, becoming smaller in ways so subtle she barely noticed them happening. And the terrifying truth was that nobody had physically forced her into that role. She had entered it through love, loyalty, habit, and the endless small accommodations marriages sometimes normalize over time. By the moment she packed the car, Shirley understood something clearly for the first time in decades. If she stayed, she would continue disappearing. So she drove west toward the Shenandoah Valley with no certainty except one. The woman who returned from that journey could not be the same woman who left. The farmhouse greeted her like memory made physical, weathered, quiet, imperfect but still standing. The porch sagged slightly. Dust coated the windows. Wild grass swallowed the old garden paths her mother once tended carefully. Years of neglect showed everywhere. And yet the house remained solid underneath it all. Shirley recognized something of herself in that immediately. She, too, had spent years neglected in invisible ways while still remaining standing. That first night alone in the house changed something inside her. There was no television filling silence, no husband moving through adjacent rooms, no pressure to manage another person's moods or expectations. Only the sounds of an old house settling around her and the strange, unfamiliar experience of complete solitude. At first, the silence felt enormous. Then slowly, it began to feel peaceful. That transition mattered deeply because Shirley had spent years mistaking emotional exhaustion for normalcy. Her previous life had always required attention directed outward. Someone needed something. Something had to be managed, anticipated, softened, or repaired. Even rest had been structured around maintaining the emotional balance of the household. For the first time in decades, nobody needed anything from her. And underneath the fear of that realization was freedom. The transformation did not happen dramatically. Shirley did not suddenly become fearless overnight. Starting over rarely looks heroic in real life. Most of the time, it looks practical, quiet, repetitive, one task after another completed while emotions slowly reorganize themselves underneath. She opened windows. She swept floors. She cleaned cabinets. She called repairmen. She made lists. And with every completed task, the farmhouse became more alive while Shirley slowly did too. That was the hidden beauty of rebuilding something physical. Restoring the house restored her sense of capability at the same time. Every repaired hinge, every cleaned room, Every functioning window reminded her that broken things were not necessarily ruined things. For years, she had unconsciously accepted the idea that her life was already finished in some essential way. Not literally over, but complete, settled, fixed permanently into its final shape. Now, standing in the middle of a half-restored kitchen at 70 years old, she discovered how false that belief had been. Life had not ended. It had reopened. That realization changed the emotional center of her story completely. Shirley was not simply escaping betrayal. She was rediscovering herself underneath decades of adaptation. She noticed this most clearly in the mornings. Back in her marriage, mornings had belonged to routine. Coffee brewed automatically, breakfast prepared efficiently, thoughts already moving toward the needs of the day. Even quiet moments carried invisible tension because her attention was never entirely her own. At the farmhouse, mornings became hers again. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee and watched light move across the back fields while nothing demanded immediate response from her. Those moments felt almost unfamiliar at first. She realized how long it had been since she experienced uninterrupted stillness without guilt attached to it. And inside that stillness, parts of her personality returned gradually. She rediscovered her love for reading. Not hurried reading squeezed between obligations, but deep sustained reading where entire afternoons disappeared inside books. She rediscovered her enjoyment of gardening, not as household labor but as pleasure. She rediscovered the satisfaction of physical work done for herself rather than performed to maintain appearances for others. Most importantly, she rediscovered decision-making. For years, even small choices had unconsciously revolved around another person's preferences. Meals, schedules, vacations, purchases, conversations. Marriage had trained her into constant adjustment. Now every choice belonged entirely to her. At first, that freedom felt overwhelming. Then it became exhilarating. The emotional power of Shirley's journey comes from how ordinary her transformation actually is. She does not become a radically different person. She becomes more fully herself. Stronger not because pain changed her identity, but because pain removed the structures suppressing it. Her daughter Claire notices this immediately during visits to the farmhouse. Shirley looks different, lighter somehow, more present inside her own life. That difference is not wealth, revenge, or even justice. It is alignment. For the first time in decades, Shirley's external life matches her internal truth. Even the restoration of the farmhouse mirrors her emotional state perfectly. The house does not become modern or unrecognizable. Shirley preserves its history while bringing it back to life. In the same way, she does not erase her past or pretend those 45 years never happened. She carries them honestly while refusing to remain trapped inside them. That distinction matters. Starting over does not require destroying everything that came before. Sometimes it means reclaiming what was always yours underneath the damage. And perhaps the most profound part of Shirley's transformation is that she stops viewing age as limitation. Society often treats older women as if their defining chapters already happened decades earlier, as if reinvention belongs only to the young. Shirley's story rejects that completely. At 70, she builds a new home, negotiates business agreements, restores land, deepens relationships, and creates a life more authentic than the one she spent decades maintaining. She proves that beginning again is not reserved for any particular age. It belongs to anyone willing to step honestly into uncertainty rather than remain trapped inside comfort built on falsehood. The farmhouse becomes symbolic of this truth. Hidden beneath dust and neglect was something structurally strong waiting to be restored. Shirley realizes the same thing about herself. The betrayal that initially looked like destruction ultimately becomes revelation. Not because suffering is beautiful, not because betrayal was necessary, but because once the illusion collapsed, Shirley finally had the chance to ask herself a question she had not seriously considered in decades. What kind of life would she choose if fear, obligation, and habit were no longer making the choice for her? The truth about deception is that it rarely disappears completely. People can hide things for years, sometimes decades, but lies leave traces behind them like footprints in wet ground. A false story requires constant maintenance. Details must be managed, records adjusted, explanations prepared in advance. And eventually, somewhere inside all that effort, something slips out of place. In Shirley's case, the entire structure of her husband's hidden life began unraveling because of a single folder left too close to the edge of a desk. That detail mattered to her long after everything happened, not because the accident itself was extraordinary, but because it revealed how fragile deception actually is beneath its appearance of control. Her husband had spent 16 years carefully managing separate lives, hidden finances, forged documents, and secret intentions. 16 years of calculated concealment. Yet the first crack appeared through something ordinary enough to happen on any Tuesday morning. A sleeve catching paper. A folder falling open. Truth entering the room uninvited. That is what makes hidden deception so psychologically exhausting for the people who create it. Lies are never static. They require continuous supervision because reality itself is constantly pushing against them. The world has a natural tendency toward exposure. Documents exist. Patterns emerge. Memory connects details eventually. Even silence carries evidence over time. Shirley began understanding this almost immediately after discovering the bank statements. The more carefully she looked, the more traces she found everywhere. Once trust broke apart, the ordinary details of her marriage rearranged themselves into evidence. Business trips that once sounded reasonable suddenly became suspicious. Financial habits she had accepted without question now carried different meaning. Even the emotional structure of their marriage appeared altered under closer examination. The private office, the filing cabinet she never touched, the subtle boundaries she had learned not to cross. Everything pointed toward the same realization. Secrecy had not been occasional, it had been architectural. Her husband had built his entire life around controlling information. That understanding disturbed Shirley more deeply than the affair itself. Infidelity was painful enough, but the hidden management behind it felt colder, more deliberate. He had not simply lied during moments of weakness. He had created systems designed to preserve ignorance. And yet, despite all that effort, the truth still survived inside details he failed to erase. The hidden bank statements, the unfamiliar account numbers, the years of payments forming recognizable patterns. The deception lasted 16 years not because it was flawless, but because Shirley trusted him enough not to investigate. That distinction became important to her emotionally. Victims of betrayal often blame themselves afterward for not noticing sooner. Shirley struggled with that at first. How could she have lived beside someone for 45 years without fully seeing him? But gradually, she realized something painful and freeing at the same time. Trust itself had been weaponized against her. Her husband depended on her decency, her loyalty, and her assumption that marriage meant honesty. The lies survived because she behaved like a sincere partner while he behaved like someone managing an operation. Once she accepted that, her shame began transforming into clarity. And clarity made her dangerous in a way her husband never anticipated. Because Shirley was methodical. After the initial discovery, she did not confront him emotionally. She gathered evidence. She observed carefully. She photographed documents. She studied timelines. Quietly, patiently, she began following the trail truth had already left behind. That process revealed something important about deception. Lies expand beyond their original purpose over time. What begins as one hidden thing requires additional lies to sustain it, then more lies to support those lies. Eventually, entire structures develop around preserving the original deception. Her husband's secret second family required hidden finances. Hidden finances required concealed accounts. The concealed accounts required secrecy about property, travel, schedules, and paperwork. And underneath it all existed another hidden motive entirely: the Greer family land. That discovery transformed the situation completely. The forged documents shocked Shirley because they revealed intent extending far beyond emotional betrayal. Her husband had spent years attempting to acquire control over property that legally belonged only to her. The geological surveys proved he knew exactly how valuable the land was long before she did. That meant every delay, every distraction, every subtle discouragement preventing her from returning to the farmhouse carried strategic purpose. He needed her disconnected from the land. He needed her uninformed. Most importantly, he needed her trusting. The emotional cruelty of that realization cut deeply because it changed the meaning of countless ordinary moments. Suggestions that they postpone visiting the property, casual remarks minimizing its importance, financial conversations redirected elsewhere. None of those moments seemed suspicious individually. Together, they formed a map of manipulation stretching across decades. And still, despite all that planning, truth remained preserved in hidden places waiting to surface. That is where Shirley's father becomes essential to the story. William Greer understood something fundamental about truth. Real evidence matters more than accusations. He suspected danger long before Shirley fully recognized it, but instead of confronting suspicions he could not conclusively prove, he preserved documentation carefully. The tin box hidden behind the loose brick represents more than evidence. It represents faith in eventual truth. William Greer believed reality would reveal itself eventually if enough of it was protected properly. And he was right. Inside that hidden compartment existed everything necessary to expose the full story: geological reports, title searches, correspondence, the second survey commissioned secretly by Shirley's husband, every document preserved patiently through years of silence. The beauty of that revelation lies in its inevitability. Her husband believed control over information guaranteed control over outcomes. But truth survived outside his reach because another person anticipated the danger and prepared accordingly. That contrast becomes one of the deepest themes in Shirley's journey. Deception relies on constant manipulation. Truth only requires endurance. The forged signatures eventually became forensic evidence. The hidden accounts became financial records. The secret surveys became legal proof. Every concealed action her husband believed buried safely inside private systems eventually transformed into documentation against him. And importantly, Shirley never needed revenge to make that happen. She did not destroy his life emotionally. She simply stopped protecting the lies. That distinction defines the moral strength of her character. Many stories about betrayal focus heavily on retaliation, dramatic confrontations, or emotional punishment. Shirley's story moves differently. Once she understands the truth fully, she commits herself to accuracy rather than vengeance. She wants records examined correctly, ownership established legally, facts documented precisely. The truth itself becomes sufficient. That approach gives the story emotional maturity. Shirley does not heal through rage. She heals through clarity. She stops carrying responsibility for maintaining someone else's false reality and instead allows actual reality to emerge publicly on its own terms. The legal proceedings reinforce this theme powerfully. Her husband attempts at first to negotiate emotionally. He frames years of deception as mistakes. He seeks sympathy. He hopes relationships might soften consequences. But records do not respond emotionally. Bank statements remain factual. Signatures remain verifiable. Documents remain dated. Truth accumulates weight slowly until denial becomes impossible. And perhaps that is the most important lesson inside Shirley's journey. Truth is patient. People often believe deception succeeds because it survives for long periods of time, but survival is not victory. Some lies persist for years simply because circumstances have not yet aligned for exposure. That does not make them permanent. It only makes them delayed. Shirley's husband built his life around delay. Delay discovery, delay suspicion, delay accountability. Meanwhile, truth waited quietly inside forgotten paperwork, hidden compartments, legal records, and the careful preparation of a father who trusted his daughter would someday need evidence more than warnings. When the collapse finally came, it arrived not as dramatic chaos but as accumulation. One document connected to another. One hidden fact illuminated the next. Gradually, the architecture of deception became visible in full. And once visible, it could never return to invisibility again. That is the thing about truth once fully seen. It changes the shape of reality permanently. Not because it creates destruction by itself, but because it removes the illusion protecting the destruction that was already there all along. When Shirley first arrived at the farmhouse in Shenandoah County, she believed she had come there to recover. The marriage was over. The betrayal had been exposed. The life she spent 45 years building had collapsed so completely that even ordinary memories now felt unstable. She thought the old house would simply become a quiet place to survive the damage. What she did not understand yet was that healing does not begin the moment pain disappears. Healing begins the moment a person stops organizing their entire existence around someone else's needs and finally turns their attention toward their own life again. At first, the farmhouse demanded practical work. Dust covered nearly every surface. The porch sagged slightly on one side. The roof needed repair. The garden her mother once loved had disappeared beneath overgrown weeds and tangled brambles. Everywhere Shirley looked, there were reminders of neglect. But unlike the emotional exhaustion she had carried inside her marriage, this work felt honest. A broken window was simply a broken window. A damaged floorboard needed repair, not emotional interpretation. The house did not manipulate her. It did not ask her to ignore reality for the sake of comfort. Every problem could be identified directly and solved patiently. That difference mattered more than she expected. For years, Shirley had been performing invisible emotional labor without fully recognizing it. She adjusted herself constantly inside her marriage. She softened conversations. She ignored discomfort. She protected routines. She carried responsibilities nobody openly acknowledged because maintaining peace had quietly become part of her identity. The farmhouse asked none of that from her. It only asked for effort. And effort, she discovered, was far less exhausting than emotional deception. Every morning she woke early and began working through the house one section at a time. She opened windows to let fresh air move through rooms closed for decades. She scrubbed cabinets. She sorted old belongings. She made lists for repairs. She walked the property with contractors and asked questions carefully, learning things she once assumed other people should handle. Something inside her changed during those weeks of work. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly. The transformation happened in layers, almost too quietly to notice at first. She began sleeping better. Her thoughts became calmer. Meals tasted different when eaten alone at the kitchen table without tension hidden beneath conversation. She found herself pausing simply to look at the mountains in late afternoon light. For years, she had mistaken emotional survival for living. Now she understood the difference. The restoration of the farmhouse became symbolic without Shirley intending it to. Every repaired part of the house reflected something being restored inside herself as well. The windows that finally opened properly after years of sticking. The porch stabilized and releveled. The garden slowly reclaimed from weeds. Everywhere she looked, neglected things responded to patience and care. And perhaps that realization mattered most of all. Neglect is not the same thing as ruin. Shirley began understanding that she, too, had been neglected emotionally for years while still remaining capable of renewal. The betrayal had wounded her deeply, but it had not destroyed the essential parts of who she was. Those parts had simply gone unattended while she spent decades caring for everyone else first. The emotional center of her healing came through purpose. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Not obsession over her husband's downfall. Purpose. That distinction defines why Shirley's story feels so human and emotionally satisfying. Many people facing betrayal become trapped inside the gravity of what was done to them. Their lives begin orbiting anger, justice, resentment, or the need for explanation. Shirley moves differently. Once she understands the truth, she redirects her energy almost entirely toward building rather than destroying. She restores the house. She protects the land. She reconnects with her daughter. She creates routines that belong fully to her. And in doing so, she slowly reclaims herself. Even the lithium discovery, which could easily have transformed into a story about wealth and revenge, becomes something more meaningful because of Shirley's choices. She does not sell the land recklessly. She does not chase luxury or public triumph. Instead, she approaches the situation carefully and intelligently. She hires her own geologists. She studies licensing agreements. She protects ownership while allowing the land to provide for future generations. For the first time in her adult life, every major decision is made entirely by her. That freedom changes her more than the money itself ever could. The farmhouse becomes alive again during the months that follow. Contractors come and go. Fresh paint replaces faded walls. The roof is repaired. Floors are refinished. Claire visits frequently, helping her mother restore not only the property but also parts of their relationship long overshadowed by the emotional structure of Shirley's marriage. Their conversations become deeper now, more honest. Without her husband's presence shaping every emotional atmosphere in the background, Shirley discovers something surprising. Peace creates room for truth. She and Claire begin speaking openly about things never fully discussed before, about loneliness, about compromise, about how easily women sometimes disappear inside roles they believe they are required to perform. Yet despite everything Shirley endured, she never becomes consumed by hatred. That is one of the most remarkable qualities in her character. She does not excuse her husband's actions. She does not forgive blindly or minimize the damage, but she refuses to make bitterness the center of her remaining years. When she learns the second family has collapsed financially after the investigation begins, she feels no triumph. The children involved, she understands, were innocent participants inside a deception created by adults. Even now, she retains empathy without surrendering clarity. That emotional balance reflects true healing. Real healing is not pretending pain never happened. It is refusing to let pain become your identity. By autumn, the farmhouse no longer feels abandoned. It feels rooted again. The garden blooms. The kitchen fills with warmth and conversation during Claire's visits. Shirley develops friendships in town. She reads for hours in the afternoons. She drinks coffee each morning at the same kitchen table where her father once sat. And slowly, she realizes something astonishing. She is happier now than she had been in decades. Not because suffering improved her life. Not because betrayal was somehow necessary. But because once the illusion collapsed, she finally stopped organizing herself around maintaining someone else's comfort. That realization becomes clearest during her final conversation with her ex-husband. When he arrives at the farmhouse months later asking for help, Shirley sees him clearly for the first time. Diminished, desperate, still hoping emotional manipulation might restore some control over consequences. But the woman standing on the restored porch is no longer the woman he spent decades managing. She listens calmly. She speaks clearly. And then she refuses to rescue him from responsibilities that were always his own. That moment matters because Shirley's healing reaches completion there, not through cruelty, but through boundaries. She no longer mistakes sacrifice for love. She no longer feels obligated to carry burdens created by someone else's choices. She has finally learned the difference between compassion and self-erasure. After he leaves, the quiet returns to the property. The mountains remain unchanged. Wind moves through the fields. Life continues with the calm steadiness of things rooted deeply enough to survive storms. And Shirley understands at last what her father preserved for her all those years ago. Not merely land, not merely wealth, a place where she could become herself again. That is why the ending of her story feels so emotionally complete. Shirley does not win because her husband loses. She wins because she recovers ownership over her own life. She rebuilds purpose where betrayal tried to create emptiness. She learns that peace is not found through controlling the past, but through choosing carefully what deserves your energy in the future. The moral of Shirley's story is simple but powerful. Sometimes the greatest form of justice is not revenge. It is rebuilding your life so completely that the people who hurt you no longer determine the shape of your happiness. Disclaimer: this story is created for storytelling and entertainment purposes inspired by emotional life themes, family struggles, betrayal, resilience, and personal transformation. Names, characters, places, and events may be fictionalized or dramatized for narrative effect. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental.